Hi everyone, welcome back for part 2 of the lecture. As we talked about in the previous lecture, we're going to talk through the structure of XML, figure out what qualifies as good or badly designed XML, and then we'll talk about XML and document type definitions. First of all, how does XML work? XML creates hierarchies or trees of data and metadata, and XML can be either data-centric, it could be document-centric. With data-centric, we are annotating data so that the data makes sense, so it's easier to use, very structured. And with document-centric approaches, the markup is used to describe the content as with HTML pages. So the document-centric approach is more loosely structured, but in that case you have more content to tag ratios, right? Which makes sense, right? If we're going to keep things a little bit looser in terms of how we are marking up our content. So in thinking about XML in terms of this tree structure, the first thing we have are roots, right? Our root elements are really the basis for our XML file. We have one root element per file, and it really acts as this wrapper after the declaration that we include for our XML file, because as we know, whenever we create these documents, these markup files, we need to include some kind of declaration that says, hey, I'm using XML. This is a version I'm using, yada yada, right? So we have one root element. With this example here, you can see that the root element is recipe, and so we're following that structure where we have one root. From there, from the root element, we have child elements, which, as you can imagine, are sort of sub-elements that go below our root element. So another example here, we have bookstore, which is acting as our root element, and then within that we have book elements for the various books that we have in our bookstore or in our library or whatever, right? Each book element acts as a child element of our bookstore root element. It is also considered a sibling of its fellow book elements, just so you know the lingo for that. Beyond root elements and child elements, we also have the grandchildren or the subchildren elements. So any child tag can have children of its own, so yay. And so if we look at, again, our bookstore example, we have the bookstore, which is our root element, and then underneath that we have our book element, which is the child of bookstore, and then we have title, which is the child of book, right? So you can see how we're following that kind of hierarchical or tree structure where you've got that root element and then you're kind of expanding from there. And so, say for example, we have this XML document and it is our bookstore XML document. We have books, we have titles, we have authors, and then we have everything content-wise we've put into these different tags, and you could just continue as long as you needed to for as many books as you have, and that would allow you to use XML to mark up this document, which is really a list of books and authors in your bookstore. As I mentioned previously, we need to include an XML declaration that says, hey, we're using XML. You should read this as an XML file. And just so you know, the version number is the version of XML we're using. The encoding, we're going to go with UTF-8 here, but this is representing the kinds of characters that can be represented in the file. And this is important because, again, we're saying, hey, this is how I want you to read and display this content for me. So the elements, which I've mentioned a little bit, are really considered kind of the base of XML, and so they're defining our metadata, they're providing a space and a structure for the content that we're implementing. And just so you know a little bit about how elements in XML are structured, they are tags. They begin with a little opening bracket and end with a closing bracket. and they have to be closed. So you can't have, for this example, you can't have element, the opening tag, and then not have the closing tag for element. If you do, then your file is not going to be readable. And then the other thing to note is that elements have to be closed in the same order that they're opened in. And I'll show you a little bit more about that in just a second. So this gets to opening things in the correct order. So as you can see here, we have a happy unicorn at the top. So we have first, and then we have second, and then we have second closing, and then we have first closing. So the parent of second is first, and so it's opening and closing on that level rather than getting mixed up. As you can see in the second example of the sad unicorn, no one believes in the unicorn, but that's because we have an issue here where we're opening with our first tag, opening with our second tag, and then we're closing with our first tag and closing with our second tag. And so just know that you always want to have your opening tag and then whatever content you have. So maybe that includes the the child elements along with content or whatever, and then you close that tag. So similar to HTML in this way, but also very much more structured than HTML, right? Because we have to follow this particular pattern or nothing's going to display properly. So the other thing to note is that our tag names, when you open them, when you close them, they need to match exactly. That does include capitalization. So as you can see here with these examples, you want to have, if you have new element as an opening tag with a capital E, you're closing new element with a capital E as well. So you're not going to have this bad approach here where we have a lowercase n in the opening tag, and then we have an uppercase n in the closing tag. So it's a lot of checking for typos and things like that to make sure that you are consistent in how you're creating these tags. Attributes, much like HTML, add additional information to an element that we're using in XML. You can have multiple attributes just like you can in HTML. There are a few rules about attributes for XML. They have to have a name, you have to have an equal sign, you have to have some kind of value in quotes. So you have your element tag, then you have the attribute immediately following that, and then an equal sign, and then some kind of value in quotes, and then you have your closing bracket. You can use single or double quotes, but you have to be consistent across the board. You can have empty quotes, but they have to be there. If you use double quotes, you can have a single quote be part of the attribute and vice versa. So with this example, you can see we have Joe's book, so we have a single quote here, so we're using double quotes on the outside. And then on the inside, we have single quotes because we're using double quotes on the inside. So XML will allow you to do that without any issue. Just be consistent. That's the biggest thing with XML, is being consistent, avoiding typos, and making sure that all of your tags match and are nested properly. And if you do that, you're going to be golden. The attribute names also have to be unique per element, so just be careful about that. Alrighty, so now we're going to move on to part 3.